back in 2009, the beginning of Bitcoin, it was the cypherpunks and everybody who was objecting to central bank authoritarianism who got together and said, we're going to make our own money. We're going to make our own money. It's called Bitcoin, and it's passive resistance. And it's going to topple the central bank empire, the central banks around the world. I predict, one of my predictions will be one of the major central banks in the world will collapse in 2021. They're highly leveraged. As your guest, Jim Rickards, points out many times, these banks are leveraged 50, 60, 70 to 1. They're leveraged more than long-term capital management was when long-term capital management was at its highest point of leverage. So Rickards would know about this stuff. And one of them is going to collapse in 2021, and that will start an avalanche out of fiat money and paper money, and the top beneficiary of that will be Bitcoin. That's one of the catalysts for a price appreciation in 2021. But my point is this, Daniela, Bitcoin is a protest against fiat money, central banks, authoritarianism. And the way the protest works is the cypherpunks and everyone involved in Bitcoin, essentially, we made our own money. It's perfect money. It has nothing to do with the state. You've separated for the first time in history, state from money. It's never been done before, ever. And now it has been finished. It has been completed. It has been figured out, and it's working. And the nation state, as we know it, is going to dissolve. Central banks are going to dissolve, and fiat money is going to go the way of all fiat money has gone over 300 years. Not a single fiat money, paper money scheme has lasted over the past 300 years. They've all gone to zero or lost 99% of their purchase power. So it should be no shock to anyone that the US dollar is going to go to zero. The British pound looks particularly horrible. That's definitely going to go to zero. All the fiat money is going to go to zero. And of course, the chief beneficiary of that would be Bitcoin. And these are the catalysts. These are the catalysts to see this price projection, and why, when we get into the numbers, you'll understand more why I have the number that I have. Right. Well, it's a magical kind of metamorphosis that turns greed into altruism. Bitcoin attracts a lot of greedy people who want to make money trading on Bitcoin, but as they're defunding central banks, and they're defunding fiat money, and they're defunding the nation state. So it's a very interesting technology that turns greed into the hardest money ever known in the human history. So the greedy folks, we need the greedy folks. We need people come for the greed, they stay for the revolution. The biggest bubble in the world by far is the bond bubble. So it's in a 300-year, it took 300 years for the bonds in the UK to get this extended and into a bubble. It took over 240 years for the American debt market to get into this bubble. It's so far in a bubble that's gone negative. Interest rates in the sovereign bond market are now actually negative. So that not even Bernie Madoff got his Ponzi scheme to that level of extremity. So that is by far the biggest bubble in the world, is the U.S. bond market and the sovereign debt market. Then you have behind that, I would say, the fiat money currency. The U.S. dollar is in an enormous. You've got a lot of still some property markets are in a huge bubble, and probably the one asset in the world now that's undervalued, that's not even very close to getting into a valuation that it should be commensurate with the rest of the markets, would be Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the cheapest asset in the world you can buy. As Paul Tudor Jones has said, it's the fastest horse in the race. Paul Tudor Jones doesn't have to say much to make a huge statement. He said that the Bitcoin price is mispriced. He said the Bitcoin price is, whenever he sees something as mispriced as Bitcoin, he gets excited to see that. And what he means by that is what I've just said, essentially, is that everything else pretty much is in a bubble. Bitcoin is one of the only assets probably that's not a bubble. It's in the most undervalued asset probably in the world today. As I said, the central banks are in a bubble. I mean, if you have a 50, 60, 70 time leverage is an enormous bubble. You've got stocks trading at 1,000 times earnings, 1,500 times earnings. Tesla stock trading at over 1,000 times earnings. I mean, by any standard measure of valuation, that would be bubble territory.
All right.
You've got a lot of bubbles in asset prices that have been fueled by central bank printing. Here's the chart of M2 money supply growth, which is growing at 20% a year. Bitcoin price is staying ahead of that MT growth. It's the only asset that's, so you got true price discovery. That's reflecting true money printing. Gold is not, doesn't have good price discovery in gold because it's been almost 100% financialized. That's why gold is lagging as badly as it is. And it's not a good store of value in this type of money printing. This is also why corporations like MicroStrategy under Michael Saylor has said, look, the real inflation rate is 20% a year. It's not 1.5% a year. It's not 2% a year. That's a government published number that doesn't take into consideration the massive asset valuations that are popping, that are in bubble territory. Who do the printing of the money are the ones that are benefiting the most from the printing of the money? No, that's by design. It's incredibly corrupt. But the real number is 20%. And Bitcoin is true price discovery that's outside of the control of central banks and government, because you've separated government from perfect money. So you have real price discovery, and Bitcoin is telling us that this 20% money supply growth per year is resulting in a hyperinflationary collapse of the US dollar against Bitcoin. Let me repeat that. The US dollar is in a hyperinflationary collapse right now against Bitcoin. And the markets, that's what the markets are telling us. You know, I'm a free marketeer. I look at markets. You know, when markets tell me stuff, they send signals. I read those signals and I invest accordingly. And that's what the market's telling us, that price discovery in Bitcoin is accurate and true. Price discovery in these other assets is completely manipulated, and it's demonstrably manipulated. JP Morgan just paid huge fines for manipulating the gold price. That used to be a conspiracy theory.
And then they made all their money.
It's demonstrably, provably not a Ponzi scheme. As a matter of fact, it's a reverse Ponzi scheme. In a Ponzi scheme, the base of the Ponzi scheme has to constantly get wider and bigger. The new money has to keep coming in to pay the investors off who have gotten into the Ponzi scheme early. That's a Ponzi scheme, as Charles Ponzi created the Ponzi scheme with his scheme of, I believe it was stamps, and they had a stamp collecting Ponzi scheme, and that's where we get the term from. But and we now also look at Bernie Madoff was running a bit of a Ponzi scheme in that he was paying off investor returns with the new money coming in. Now let's look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually the opposite. Every 4 years, the amount of money that's mined on a daily basis shrinks by 50% in what's called the halving. So we started off with 10 minutes, and then we had a halving down to 25, and then a halving down to 12 and a half, and a halving down to 6.25. So actually, it's a reverse Ponzi scheme. The amount of money that's entering the system is shrinking, not expanding. So that's a very simple point. And anyone who calls it a Ponzi scheme, A, doesn't know what a Ponzi scheme is, and B, has never looked at Bitcoin for more than 5 seconds, or just accepted like a Nouriel Rubini tweet as if that has a meaning, but he's never looked at it either. So that's demonstrably, provably wrong.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's just, if you know what 2 + 2 = 4, then you know that this is not a Ponzi scheme if you look at a definition of a Ponzi scheme and you look at the distribution of coins within Bitcoin. It's so simple that any 9-year-old would look at this for 5 minutes and tell you exactly the same thing. But again, we have a mainstream media that doesn't qualify to have the intelligence of a 9-year-old. They simply repeat propaganda points because they're propagandists.